Welcome, everybody. My name is Brooke Curtis, and I'm going to be presenting today with Dana Absher on maintaining a supportive school community. And as always, we'd like you to remember that while we are here in Zoom, that we have our own expectations. To please be kind, use the chat box, the questions to ask questions or respond to any of our slides to give us some feedback as well. Have integrity. Keep your words positive and be respectful, and as best as possible we will ensure that those expectations are upheld. But if at any time you're not able to stay or something happens with regards to our chat, you will be able to see a recording of the chat at the following links, and those will also be shared at the end of the presentation as well. If you haven't already, please indicate what district you're from so we can have a little idea of who's with us. And again, I apologize, I'm not able to actively see the chat box as we're moving through this, but we appreciate you all being here. It did look like in the poll we have a good chunk of school administrators with us here today. So we hope that as you go through today's chat, that you'll get some ideas to work with your PBIS team to help build that supportive school community as your brick and mortar walls might be coming down and expanding into those distance classrooms. And our goal today is to talk to you about how you can have some continuity of your PBIS system across those, as well as building those relationships to have that school community. All right, so another way we want to just kind of get started is have a little bit of a check-in, and these are some ideas that we've seen as far as how to check in with students, especially for those that might be going virtual. We wanted to try and use some of that with you today in the chat box. So what's one thing you're wanting to improve, maybe not just this week, but this, as we embark on this school year, what's one thing you're wanting to see improve? And I thought that you'd be able to do the emojis in the Zoom chat box because you can do that on some other platforms like Microsoft Teams, but I don't think we're able to do emojis into the Zoom chat box. But go ahead and maybe give us a little feedback about how you're feeling as you're getting ready to embark on a lot of unknowns this school year. And even what is known is going to change. Lots of up and downs possibly. So I'm hearing the term of plans are going to be very fluid this school year. So just kind of check in with yourself, how you're feeling, what's one thing you want to work on and improve to get your system started. And then also, you know, just how are we wanting to greet each other? This is just some examples of things that teachers can do for in-person instruction as well, given that we know a lot of districts are moving towards mask mandates. So just ways to still have that connection, even if you're not going to be having that physical contact. So is there anyone wanting to share what is going on in the chat box, Dama, maybe as far as things that people are wanting to improve or how they're feeling?
Sorry, I was muted. Feeling fluid and fine. I like that choice of words. Yes. Excited. I look forward to seeing my kiddos in person and contributing to their peace in these confusing times. Anxious and excited. Focused. Good to go. I like it. Let's just roll with it.
Awesome.
Yeah,
I really love the...
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Being more pour in and then I'll be quiet. Actually teach a class called PBIS and we plan and execute all PBS events for the year. Worried how I'll teach this class if we're virtual, and great anticipation of the new. Now I'll let you get started.
No problem. I was just going to say there was lots of positive emotions going on in there. And I think that's wonderful because we know that our kids eat up our emotions. So if we're putting out that positive energy, our students are going to come back and feel that positive energy and come back to our school buildings or virtual classrooms with the same outlook. So just some logistics. We've already mentioned that you should have a copy of the link for the handouts to today's presentation in the chat box. But again, we are the Florida PBIS project, and we work with the OSAP and Florida Department of Education to provide you with technical assistance around your MTSS for behavior or positive behavior intervention supports. you can follow us at the following links. So let's go ahead and get started. We are the fourth in a PBIS team series that started with planning for the school year and setting up your teams virtually. Then the next two sections had to do with reestablishing your tier one system, with the second part really focusing on that trauma-informed care and social emotional lens for your tier one system. And today we're going to focus a little bit more on that school-wide community and relationship building and some key practices that help build that. So with regard to some of the questions as far as documentation for how to progress monitor across the two, that might be something that's coming up in some of our further chats as we move into the school year. Up for discussion, we have talked about some of that. So we'll definitely keep that in mind. And when possible, we'll talk to you a little bit about some of the resources that we have here to share with you. So our objectives today is really to look at which of our PBIS critical elements focus on that school-wide community and how to link those across the settings. And then we'll talk specifically to those key practices that are needed for connection across those different learning environments, as well as provide you with some resources, activities, or exemplars when possible. And so I just really wanted to start out with this quote here from the president and CEO of Castle, that when physical distance is deemed necessary, it's even more crucial that social and emotional connectedness is even more critical, because we hear that term social distancing, and really I'd like to think of it more as we're physically distanced, but we're still social beings and we can still connect to people socially. So in thinking of that, with some of our recent revisions for our Tier 1 training, if any of you have been part of any Tier 1 trainings this summer virtually, we really work with school teams to focus on building a supportive school community. And we ask teams to really think about what school looks like, feels like, sounds like, if it were to respond to the needs of students and staff more effectively. So go ahead and share in the chat box what you feel a school should look like in order to respond to their student needs more effectively. And Dama, if you don't mind sharing out any of the words or ideas that are being shared in the chat box for me.
Sure, I'd be happy to. People are still thinking at the moment.
Is it a school that's collaborating with teachers and staff?
I'm seeing restorative practices, flexible, listening, adaptable, safe, one that seeks input, welcoming and mutual respect. Great responses. I like that.
Awesome. And so
Restorative practices, flexible, safe,
okay.
friendly, culturally responsive, proactive, not reactive, affective language, building relationships, reflective, restorative, clear expectations, and social emotional learning. Awesome.
Awesome. And it would have been awesome if I could have taken all of those responses and created this little word cloud here based on your responses. But here's just a sample of like what, when we do these activities, these are some things that other teams have come up with, that there's that sense of belonging, there's respect. I love the idea of being flexible and fluid, that we have increased engagement, we have understanding. And now, as we start to embark on this new journey, what changes would have to occur at your school to create more supportive school climate across those various learning models? Are there things that need to occur as far as some policy or practice? What needs to change in terms of our staff behavior? We know there's going to be tons of changes to the physical environment going on, but how can we not only account for the changes that are needed in order to increase safety, but also feel that connection? So these are all things that we want to think about as we start to plan for the school year. And I know we all are, as educators, constantly thinking about those things. So we're really going to start with what we know works, and here's what we know that works. We're going to focus on those critical elements that help to support that positive climate, the mental health and well-being of our students, and equity, as these really serve as the foundation to meeting our student needs. And we do that through our PBIS framework, because it really is unifying to bring all of these pieces together. So we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about, I think, Dama, I've heard you call it as those PBIS tangibles, those things that you can physically see and touch when you're in the class or in the school building, and how we can use those pieces to really build that school community.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll start here with prevention strategies, as these are those critical elements that help you to support the school-wide system and support student outcomes. But one thing that you'll notice that's central to these critical elements is the need to build those positive relationships. Because we already know that by implementing PBIS with fidelity, you'll be doing most of these prevention pieces that are seen, but what we want to first focus on is ways to build that relationship across the educational setting as a school and classroom community. And as always, we want to make sure that as we engage in building those relationships, that we're being purposeful with how we manage those differences in culturally responsive ways to really meet the needs of all of our students. Because especially right now, as we've gone through what some are saying is it could be a very traumatic experience for some of our families. There might be loss of jobs, a lot of things that have been going on outside of our school buildings that are going to impact our students as they return. So we need to be purposeful with how we're assessing our student needs, how are we communicating with our families, and that our relationship there that we establish across our school community really enhances those PBIS practices that we know that work. So here's a resource. You see the link at the bottom of the PowerPoint slide. It's from the Search Institute. It's on ways to build developmental relationships during the crisis. Not just COVID crisis, but it can be through any time of crisis. But the idea here is that we want to make sure that we foster these relationships with our students by expressing care, challenging their growth, providing them with support, sharing the power with our students, as well as expanding their possibilities. This can be both within a school brick and mortar setting, as well as through that virtual setting. And I really liked this resource because it can be used almost like a checklist. You see in the little snapshot of the resource that there's little boxes there you can add to it for it. But the idea here is that with regard to expressing care, for example, that you want to show that they matter to you. So coming up with ways to personalize things virtually, some examples are there, but within the school building, are we able to still do things like smaller lunch bunches, or if we're not using the cafeteria and we're in the classroom, how can we build that relationship safely and personalize the experience for our students? And when we do that and we learn more about them, we can start to challenge our students' growth, push them to be better, not just with academics, but maybe in some of their non-academic settings, getting them back into being a learner. They've spent countless hours, I'm sure, if they're like my son, on their video game device, much more than I'd like him to be. He's going to need help getting reconnected back into the learning mode and setting goals, especially if you've got children who may be in the virtual setting, really working with them for how to help them self-monitor, things like that. So that could be an idea with regard to some of that progress monitoring, is creating tools that help the children learn how to self-monitor, which really even taps into that idea of sharing the power, giving them a choice, helping them to create checklists or options of how they complete assignments. We do this a lot in PBIS, the idea of sharing power, when we involve our students in the classroom rules and development of those rules based on our school-wide expectations. So we can take these same concepts and ideas about fostering relationships and really extend it into that virtual learning platform. And again, especially those of you who are school leaders or are leaders of your PBIS team, as you start to do that implementation plan and that rollout of here's some strategies, really thinking about that continuity piece. You know, if we want to provide support through those check-ins, whether it be daily or weekly, how are we going to have that occur within our in-person instruction and our virtual instruction, so that there's the continuity piece there. So all these relationships need to be fostered within that PBIS framework of the school's community and their core values and curriculum. So thinking about what it means to have that positive school-wide community that supports that mental health well-being, that positive climate equity. Our expectations, the what we teach, and those lessons and reward systems of how we teach need to be applied across all settings. And as we embark in this new way of learning, across all learning models. So we need to have that consistency. So if your school team hasn't already done so, you'll want to make sure that you start with this. And then you can look back at some of our previous chats. Like I said, the first one in the, or not the first one, the second one in our PBIS team series for restarting your tier 1 has a lot of examples in there about ways you can adapt your PBIS expectations to fit across the different settings. So you can look back for those in examples. But one example I'm giving you here is one from the National TA Center. What I really liked about this example is that it's not two separate matrices. It's not, here's our PBIS for our virtual setting, and here's the PBIS for in-person setting. It's really showing one whole school community as a whole. And you can see that they have their expectations and what it looks like in the different settings, such as their online group and online independent work, and how it can be implemented across all settings and contexts there at the bottom. So we still need to make sure that we're maintaining that sense of consistency across the settings when it comes to teaching behaviors, and we'll want to have as cohesive of a process for teaching behavior across those formats. So I put on there, gone are the days of doing those big whole group assemblies, coming together, doing a pep rally. We're going to be using those virtual pep rallies, maybe broadcasting our morning announcements, if we're able to do it simultaneously, again, so that all of our students, whether they're at in-person instruction or distance learning, are receiving that same message of how we're teaching the behavior across the settings, and it's consistent. If you're not doing that synchronous instruction, maybe, I know there's some schools that are doing, like, the distance learning will follow the same bell schedule as the in-person learning. But if you're not doing that and it's going to be a more fluid type of distance learning thing, you want to make sure that you're able to have some sort of check-in to make sure that they're getting that instructional piece and really being inclusive in the plan. If there's other strategies that some of you may have already come up with, please feel free to share them out, and Dama, interrupt me at any time if anything's coming up in the chat box.
There is a question. I'm glad you said that. It just popped up. What resource did the previous slide come from? And I believe that was
that came from the National TA Center, and I believe we have the link coming up. I'll make sure to point that out on one of our slides here if it wasn't on that last slide.
Yes. And thank you for asking that. We are going to unpack several other pieces of that. It's a great guidance document that we'll reference throughout. So like Brooke said, we'll make sure you know where to find it.
So just going back here and circling back to formal strategies for teaching, you know, if your teaching implementation plan was that your expectations were taught during morning meetups, what is that going to look like in that virtual piece? And again, the goal here really to build that sense of community is that it's aligned and as continuous as possible. It's not going, you know what, we're going to provide this morning meetup in person, but we're not able to do it virtually, so they're not going to get that. They're going to get something different. We want to have as much continuity as possible. And we want to make sure that we're doing it with fidelity. So the way that this is set up is the idea here is that you might have these two different models, brick and mortar and distance learning, but the idea is that across both formats, lesson planning, teaching times can be integrated within a master schedule. Students can help create those checklists for being prepared for learning. They can help monitor their behavior. That can occur in either of those settings, and having that detailed out for your teachers, for your students as part of that implementation plan will really help foster not only the fidelity piece, but that sense of community. It really also helps when we have that consistency and fidelity. That in and of itself can build a sense of connectedness among, especially among our staff sometimes, because they know what's going to be reinforced. They'll know everybody's on the same page if we have this really consistent plan, which I know as administrators right now with the ever-changing regulations and data that's coming to you is really hard to have a plan. So it's like somebody said in the beginning, it's about being flexible and fluid with your plan, but the idea is that we have that continuity there. So again, the idea that if we're teaching expectations during the first 5 days of school following morning announcements, you might have an adaptation in there for the virtual classroom, especially if it's not synchronous, that they'll be doing it during a daily meetup or whatnot, but that everybody's held to that same standard when it comes to that expectations as well. I think it's really important too to think about the idea of lesson planning with that student creating checklist or monitoring their behaviors or those check-ins, because that goes back to that handout we shared with you about building the relationship. If we think about how we're sharing that power, how we're expressing care, and how we're supporting growth, these are all things that our PBIS lesson plannings can support. All right, so ongoing less formal teaching of behavior occurs throughout the campus. And we often talk about having that strong visibility creates that sense of connectedness. We can have that same sense of connectedness in that distance learning platform. And as I was kind of looking at this slide and thinking about this content, I really started to think about when I walk into a school campus and you can see their PBIS expectations everywhere. You can see evidence of the reward system as you walk through classrooms or in the hallways, and you can see those tangible PBIS items. It really reminds me sometimes of when you're like walking into an athletic event or something where like everybody's pumped up for their home team, like we're all in here for a common goal. So while these strategies may be informal, they can really be just as important for building that sense of community and school connectedness. So that classroom poster versus that classroom homepage can, really tying it back to, yes, you're not here physically in our building, but you're still part of our school community. And we have some examples of some pages that schools have submitted showing their expectations in their distance learning. School pledges, school songs, having a mantra, things that are your students recite, as part of their daily interaction is a great way to build that sense of community. And one thing on here that maybe doesn't get as often as it should is the idea of that family recognition, especially as we're moving into our families really being those educational partners with some of our students who will be engaged in the distance learning. How are we making sure that we're recognizing not only our staff, but our families for engaging in our school-wide expectations? Because we know that by recognizing and acknowledging appropriate behaviors, we're also teaching. This here is just additional resources that we've shared in previous chats and want to continue to share. They're great short videos that you can share with your staff on ways to incorporate, making those connections, the relationships in the school, and creating that sense of belonging. Unfortunately, we don't have time to watch them today, but they are there for you to look at and share with your staff. So as I was saying, that acknowledging appropriate behaviors or rewarding can be something that is used not only to reinforce behavior, but as a teaching tool as well. So we can earn these rewards both in person as well as in distance learning. So really just thinking about the adaptations that are needed to keep the system functioning across settings. Their rewards are great teaching tools, and they're a great way to foster that positive relationship. So teams need to make sure that they have plans to support the reward system virtually and make sure that it's inclusive. We're going to talk in just a minute about some of those key practices of staying connected. So really, how are we making sure that the fidelity of reward system is in our distance learning? You know, if we're doing that verbal specific praise and posting it on a class message board, how are we ensuring that that student's receiving it? So are we creating a system to check in with our students and our families on a regular basis, not just for their academics, but for their social emotional needs as well? And you'll want it, you know, this might be something that when you talk about progress monitoring and maybe you're doing something like an adapted check-in, check-out, we typically would think of that as, excuse me, a tier 2 intervention, but it may be at this, as we get started, to make sure that things are up and running, we might need to increase our intensity of our check-ins with our students and have it be part of our tier 1 system. So just a little bit more on acknowledging appropriate behaviors. Again, it builds that sense of community because we as PBIS team leads or administrators can really highlight our educators and classroom examples of those that are effectively supporting their students through these key practices during both in-person and remote instruction. When we give that personal feedback to our students as well as our teachers in distance learning, it really helps strengthen that relationship. So here's just some examples. You see a positive office referral being shared. Again, it gives that verbal specific praise in the teacher comment section, and you can see which of the expectations that student was engaged in. And then here's just a shout out here to Timbercrest Elementary, I believe from Volusia. They acknowledged their safety patrol team through respect, responsibility, and safety with a pizza party, and they even were able to create that pizza party virtually. And just some additional examples of ways to engage in PBIS practices with our students and things that you'll have to consider as you open that schools back up. I love the one of the cars. My teenage niece recently did that with some of her friends to have a social distancing party. They like tailgate in the back so that everybody was far away from each other, but still able to be social. So just some ideas to help kids stay connected while still social distancing or physical distancing. I'm going to turn it over to Dama. And this is the document that was asked where that matrix was found is in this document here, Returning to School During and After Crisis. And you can see the link here. And Dama is going to finish up and talk to us about the key practice of connecting.
All right, thanks, Brooke. And I'll direct you to the chat box because I put the link in there. I know it was asked for and it's here on the slide, but just in case it's helpful or anybody wants to click on it to make sure you can save it or bookmark it for later. It's packed with very easy to follow guidance across different roles. So from the state perspective to the district, to the school team, to the educator in the classroom, really about thinking through those different key features such as connection, screening students, supporting, teaching, and monitoring. And I think you'll find a lot of resources in there, but we're going to focus on the connection piece as that relates to building that sense of community across the different settings. So with that in mind, I want to tell you a little bit about where this idea or where these ideas come from within the document. There are 3 key considerations or recommendations for getting back to reopening campuses. And the one we're focused on, I love, and it's all about focusing on evidence-based, culturally relevant practices across social, emotional, behavioral, and academic domains, and then doing them well. So it's kind of like, let's focus on the things that are important and let's do them well and focus around those key kind of tangible practices. And a really big part of that is connecting with our stakeholders. So what does that look like? It's really about sharing and valuing others' perspectives. We know we have a lot of students and parents and community members and educators and staff members and coworkers with multiple opinions, backgrounds, perspectives about what's going on currently and the best way for us to reopen schools. So it's important that people feel like their voice is heard and valued and included in our decisions, that we focus on building positive relationships, again, with our students and our coworkers within that building and within the walls of the building and outside the walls of the building. Um, Ensuring that we are considering new ideas and new perspectives that may not be like our own, and then really increasing ownership, engagement, and active support of all of our stakeholders. We want to ensure relevance and adapt to those needs, and this is who our stakeholders are. So if you think about that, we have a lot of different stakeholders we need to consider. And when we think about families, students, and teachers, it's all of them, those that are in person and in our brick and mortar campus, those that are choosing distance as their option. And even within distance, there are a few different options that I know different districts have available. So some of those are kind of like a live virtual version. Some are for students that are maybe choosing a Florida virtual or a county virtual at their own pace. But all of those families and all of those students and all of those teachers are part of our stakeholders that we need to be connecting with, along with those community and agency partners, all of the different specialists that support our schools, all the itinerant staff and support staff. So while that's a lot of perspectives, that's also a ton of support and a ton of good ideas. So it's just important to really think about all of the different perspectives across all of the different stakeholder groups when we can see them and when they are participating from a distance. So how do we maintain that connectedness with our stakeholders? And one thing that's important as we're communicating, and maybe we have good ideas. So as a school team or as a classroom teacher, you may have ideas about how you want to communicate with the stakeholders, but it's also important to find out their preference. What's their preferred method of staying connected and being communicated with? I think about my own preferences for how I like to communicate with others, and then also how I like to receive communication. So while we can't make all stakeholders individually satisfied with each way that we communicate, I think collectively as a whole, it's important to know. So if we use a lot of social media, that's fun, but we may be missing a group of folks that maybe aren't on Facebook or aren't on Twitter. Maybe if we do phone calls, maybe it's hard to listen to that voicemail by the time I get it at the end of the day. I really, should have known that earlier in the day. Some folks prefer text messages, and I know there are lots of different apps you can use so that you're not necessarily sharing your personal cell phone number with folks, but you can use different ways to text through like the Remind app, or I believe there are some ways that you can do that through Google, where you can text out to folks without them really being able to use and access your personal message. But really this resource, it's available in our handouts, and it's a communication survey or an example of a communication survey where not only can you get some input on how folks want to be communicated with and receive information, but also how often is their day of the week that's best, or frequency that's best, languages that are important to include in the different translations, and preferred time of day. So again, we're not going to make everyone happy, but I know personally as a parent and as an educator, if I know that my input has been sought out and considered, then I do feel like at least I had a little input on how I'm communicated with and the ways that are easiest for me to receive information.
And Dama, I just wanted to add to that. I was having that same thought, and there it's listed as the last bullet point there, is that you really plan to use that feedback from your families, students, and staff, because there's in order to maintain that connectedness, because it's one thing to solicit feedback, but then to not acknowledge it or not incorporate it into your problem solving or into your plan, it loses that little bit of value there.
Absolutely. Good point. And then the things that we'll share here, again, the content comes from that document, the resource document that we mentioned, and the link is there in the chat box on returning to school during and after a crisis, and some considerations across brick and mortar and distance learning. So if you think about the things that I'll share here, we're going to start with school-wide practices that are going to really build that sense of community and connection, regardless of where we are, on any given day or any given week, or if we have periods where things change throughout the quarter or the semester. So the considerations for school-wide practices are things like, how do we use greetings and plan regular check-ins with our students and families? We want to make sure that information is accessible, and we have to be willing, like Brooke mentioned, we have to use the feedback that we get and make adaptations to meet their needs. So that might mean that in these planning weeks, we have some really good ideas of school-wide practices that we're going to adopt and that we think are going to work well. But once we start to use those plans and implement those plans, we need to have ways to get feedback from the folks that are impacted and then be willing to make some adaptations to meet their needs. And that might mean that we have to regroup and problem solve and maybe add some additional options within the framework that we set up for learning. We also have to think about school-wide ways that we're building relationships and are purposeful with our communication. So, and that it's bidirectional. So it's not just us as school systems and as districts or classroom teachers sharing one-way information or communication out, but we also have to have easy ways for us to receive that communication in from families on what's working. And I know that was one of the questions around progress monitoring, and it made me think of this slide on progress monitoring our entire system, how things are working, how the modes of learning are working, and also being willing to use that information to change what we're doing. So encouraging families to motivate and monitor their students' learning. So it's kind of like we're going to be leaning on students and families to help us within the school building to monitor the progress of how they're doing with the different versions of learning that we have available. So are those things working? If you've got students learning from home, do families feel like they have the resources needed? Do they understand the different formats or the different locations that their children are supposed to be checking in? So for instance, I know earlier in the spring we shared some resources around just organizing that information. So if you think about what are the implications for brick and mortar and distance learning? If we have, let's say, we use Google Classroom within our school campus, what are the ways that we're going to utilize that for students that are in the classroom physically and those that are at home? So it's kind of like that working smarter, not harder. You don't want to have to do twice the amount of work. You want to have one seamless system that folks know where to get their assignments. If I've chosen to work from home or learn from home, I know where to get my resources or where to access electronic textbooks or where I'm supposed to get my assignments for the day or for the week. But then that we can use those same features when students are absent. So let's say there's periods of time where a student has missed school, is home for a period of time, and then returns. We want to make those practices as seamless as possible where folks know what's expected as a school campus. And then within the classroom, it's going to be kind of similar, the same idea about communicating, having that bidirectional communication between the classroom teacher and the family and student. And again, working smarter, whatever things, lessons you put in place in the classroom, are there ways that that could be recorded? Can you think through ways that you can record your live lessons or live stream your lessons so that if a student is at home or they're homesick, they can benefit from the same information and same lesson without that classroom teacher having to do live lessons virtually and live lessons in person, but really kind of utilizing the resources to do that one lesson, but benefit the students that are in class and the ones that are at home. So let's think about those examples of connecting. The positive greeting at the door when you're on a school campus. What does that look like in a virtual setting? It looks like checking in and connecting with, maybe like Brooke did in the beginning or mentioned in the beginning, having students, use an emoji to say how they're doing, or having greetings, or how do you want to be greeted when you enter the virtual classroom. And then, of course, when they enter physically in the classroom, we can keep our distance and not touch, but be able to acknowledge students as they come in, having opportunities for students to pair up and do joint activities face-to-face in a safe, spaced out setting, but also in those virtual settings to be sure that we're including ways and making sure our teachers have the knowledge and access and resources to use, let's say, virtual breakout rooms and discussion boards, using Google Docs and teaching students to use Google Docs to collaborate on group projects or group assignments. And what I think is interesting when we think about this, when we have students in the early grades, we often have lots of jobs, right? We teach students to be the line leader and the person that passes out the paper or collects the assignments. And then when you get to a college level at the university, oftentimes our professors had teachers assistants, TAs, and it's a job, or you have graduate assistants. So we have this kind of span in between where I feel like oftentimes in the upper elementary grades, the middle school and high school, we are losing out on that great opportunity to include a teacher assistant and use a student who's like really good with technology. So if you've got teachers that are a little hesitant to use some of the technology, maybe they can identify a student that can help with the technology pieces, that can help set things up, can help live stream lessons, but really do that under the guidance and supervision of the teacher or of the school team, but really utilizing their strengths to compensate for things that maybe some of our teachers are uncomfortable with. I know my own children help me a lot with learning technology. So like has been mentioned, we want to develop plans for connecting that mirror each other. So it's that working smarter, whatever it is we do in brick and mortar, what does that look like in a distance learning or virtual learning scenario? If we've got weekly classroom newsletters, how do we send those out electronically? Make sure whatever your classroom rules are, they're aligned with your school-wide expectations, and you have infused what that looks like in a virtual setting. So you can have the same expectations and rules, and they're just adapted for when students are accessing lessons in a virtual setting. And here are some examples of some different things that we've seen and how to incorporate things like Pride Day. I know in Lecanto Middle, they had lots of things in the spring that looked just like they do on campus, except it was virtually. So in this one, they posted a picture online. So if you had your school shirt on, you could get PBIS points for posting a picture wearing your Lecanto Middle Panther shirt on Pride Day. Having those social emotional check-ins, you can use those virtually or in classroom settings. Here's some more examples from Lecanto Middle. They had reading day. Take a picture of you and your favorite book and post it. Having the pet day within the Spirit Week, so things you normally would have done on campus, but you're at home. Take a picture of your pet and post it to the Google Classroom. And then using chalk, create a message of hope on your sidewalk or driveway. Or you can create a mini poster if you didn't have sidewalk chalk and post those pictures to Miss Melito's social emotional learning Google Classroom, and students were able to get their PBIS points there. And we want to show you a really cool example from Timbercrest Elementary. The principal did morning announcements on Twitter every day. They were so exciting, and I think this will give you some fun ideas. You can follow them at Timbercrest ELEM on Twitter if you want to get those examples.
And I'm going to encourage you all to check it out and follow the link because we are hitting our time, Dama. So I'm going to move us through to the end of the chat because this is really our last bit of content, I believe. Yes.
That's it. It's just resources at the end. So I don't know if anybody wants to stick around to see and get excited about Timbercrest, or if you want to follow on your own. But they do an amazing job of creating a sense of community every single day, in or out of the school building.
But for those of you who want to continue to get more resources from the National TA Center, this is where you can find the document for returning to school during and after crisis that we referenced quite a bit throughout here. You can always look onto the apbs.org for additional resources, as well as follow us on Facebook. Our upcoming chat is communicating across all stakeholders in preparation for the upcoming school year. That's taking place August 11th. So that'll really just enhance a lot of what we talked about today in how are you establishing those communication systems. And if you'd like to provide any feedback on today's chat, and I believe Betsy's got a quick poll to post here.
I do. I'm just going to launch this last poll, just asking how helpful today's chat was. We hope you can join us for our next chat. And Dama and Brooke, you guys did an amazing job. There were some really great ideas. And I love the positivity and that everybody is so eager and excited to see our kids again. Did you guys have anything else before we wrap up today?
No, I just wanted to say that I know that this is going to be a challenging year, a year for a lot of growth. As I was preparing this chat and thinking about all the resources that we provide as a project, it just reminded me that as a practitioner, this might be a really great time to, look at some new strategies that can be very effective to incorporate into it out of need right now that really will help you as things start to return to normal. So really the idea of doing what we know works well and doing those few things consistently with fidelity, I think will be really helpful.
The Timbercrest videos of the daily morning announcements and shout outs from the principal.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. That was an awesome chat.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Have a great school year.
Okay, I'm ending the poll. I got all the answers.